For 11 years, nothing unexpected arrived in my mailbox. Bills arrived, advertisements arrived, the occasional holiday card from someone I hadn't seen in years arrived. But surprises? Those stopped a long time ago. Funny how grief changes your relationship with possibility. At first, after someone dies, every ringing phone feels important. Every knock at the door makes your heart jump. Every unfamiliar number sparks a tiny irrational hope. Then enough time passes, the Pope fades, the world becomes predictable again. Quet, manageable save. That Tuesday morning began like every other Tuesday. I woke up before sunrise because I always did. Not because I needed to, because sleeping late felt wrong somehow. The house was still dark when I shuffled into the kitchen and started the coffee maker. The familiar gurgling sound filled the silence that had occupied these rooms for more than a decade. I stood by the window waiting for the coffee to finish, the same window, the same view, the same routine. Some mornings I could almost convince myself that routine was enough, that a life carefully repeated was still a life. The coffee finished brewing, I poured a cup. A dead exactly one spoonful of sugar, no more, no less, the way I'd been doing it for years, the way she'd taught me. I carried the mug toward the front door and stepped outside to collect the mail. The air smelled faintly of rain, the neighborhood was quiet. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, nothing unusual. Nothing remarkable. At least, that's what I thought. Until I opened the mailbox, there were only 3 envelopes inside: an electric bill, a grocery store flyer, and a cream-colored envelope with no return address. I almost tossed it aside with the junk mail. Almost, then I saw the handwriting. The coffee nearly slipped from my hand. I froze, completely froze. For a second, my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. Because I knew that handwriting, not generally, not vaguely. I knew it the way you know your own signature. The way you know the sound of a familiar laugh from another room, the way you know a voice you've heard thousands of times. My eyes traced each letter again. Slowly, carefully. The curve of the capital A, the slight tilt to the right, the way certain letters connected when they shouldn't. I had seen that handwriting on birthday cards, on grocery lists, on sticky notes, attached to the refrigerator, on recipes stuffed into kitchen drawers, on little messages left beside my coffee cup when she had to leave early. I knew that handwriting because it belonged to my wife, and my wife had been dead for 11 years. The world suddenly felt very still, the kind of stillness that arrives right before a storm. I stared at the envelope for what felt like minutes. Maybe it was only seconds. I honestly don't know. Mary gets strange around moments like that. Your mind remembers feelings more clearly than time. My first thought wasn't logical. It wasn't reasonable. It wasn't even coherent. It was simply, no, not possible. I turned the envelope over. No return address, no explanation. Just my name written in handwriting I hadn't seen since the year we buried her. Throat tightened, not from sadness, not yet, from confusion. Pure confusion. I carried the envelope inside and sat down at the kitchen table. The coffee beside me had already started cooling. I didn't notice. I couldn't take my eyes off the envelope. There are moments in life when you know that opening something will change your day. Then there are moments when you suspect it might change something much bigger. This felt like the second kind. My fingers hesitated along the edge. Part of me wanted answers. Another part was afraid of them, because whatever was inside couldn't possibly make sense. And if it did, I wasn't sure I was ready for that. For a brief moment, a memory surfaced. Not a grand one, not some dramatic scene from our life together. Just a Tuesday afternoon years ago. She was standing at this same table writing a grocery list, complaining about my terrible handwriting, logging because I had somehow managed to spell 2 words wrong. On a note that contained only 4 words, I remember her shaking her head, smiling me that if she ever disappeared, nobody would be able to read my notes. The memory arrived without warning and disappeared just as quickly, leaving behind the same empty chair, the same quiet house, and the same impossible envelope. I finally opened it, carefully. The paper inside was thicker than I expected older. The faint scent of dust and aging paper drifted upward. My pulse quickened. Inside was not a letter. Not exactly. It was a journal. A small journal worn around the edges, the cover softened by time. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. My confusion deepened. Why would someone mail me a journal? Why now? And how did it connect to her? Then I opened the cover. The first page contained only a few handwritten lines. That handwriting, again, undeniably hers. There was no longer any room for doubt, no explanation, no greeting, no clue about who had sent it, just a single entry. And one sentence that made every hair on my arm stand up, because it wasn't written to the world. It wasn't written to strangers. It wasn't even written to herself. It was written to me. And as I stared at those words, a realization settled over me. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to place this journal in my hands. Someone had waited for years, maybe longer than years. The mystery was no longer whether the journal belonged to my wife. It did. The mystery was why it had arrived now, and who had decided that after 11 years, it was finally time for me to read it. I didn't read the first entry immediately. I wish I could tell you I did. I wish I could tell you curiosity took over, and I devoured every page right there at the kitchen table. But that's not what happened. Instead, I sat there staring at the journal as though it might disappear if I blinked too hard. The morning coffee beside me had gone cold, the house was silent, and for the first time in years, silence felt different, not empty waiting. I rested my hand on the worn cover and looked around the kitchen. It was strange. I'd sat in that exact chair thousands of times since Anna died, thousands long enough for grief to become furniture, long enough for loneliness to stop feeling like loneliness. It had simply become life. People imagine grief as something dramatic. They imagine tears, breakdowns, the sleepless nights. And in the beginning, sometimes it is, but eventually grief becomes quieter than that. Eventually, it learns your schedule. It sits beside you while you eat breakfast. It rides with you to the grocery store. It watches television with you at night. After enough years, it stops feeling like an intruder. It becomes a roommate, one you never invited, one that never leaves. I looked toward the refrigerator. A faded photograph was still attached with the same magnet it had been hanging from for more than a decade. Anna hated that picture, said it made her nose look crooked. I always told her she was imagining things. Now I couldn't imagine taking it down. Funny how that works. When someone is here, you barely notice the little things. After they're gone, the little things become everything: the photograph, the handwriting on an old recipe card, a coffee mug pushed too far back in a cabinet, the sweater you can't quite bring yourself to donate, tiny artifacts. Proof that someone existed, proof that you existed together. I reached for my coffee and took a sip before realizing it was cold. For a moment, I almost laughed. Anna would have made fun of me for that. She always claimed I became absent-minded whenever I was worried about something. "You're thinking again," she'd say, as if thinking were a dangerous hobby. The memory came so naturally that I smiled before I realized what I was doing. Then the smile faded. Not because the memory hurt, because I couldn't remember the last time I'd smiled at one. For years, every memory had carried a sharp edge. Every reminder felt like reopening something that never fully healed. So eventually I stopped looking, stopped revisiting certain places, stopped listening to certain songs, stopped ordering certain meals, not consciously, not all at once. It just happened. The way rivers slowly change direction. I stopped going to the little Italian restaurant downtown because it had been our place. Stopped taking Sunday drives because we'd always done that together. Stopped making her favorite blueberry pancakes because eating them alone felt wrong. People called it moving on. But if I'm honest with myself, I hadn't moved on at all. I'd simply learned how to stand still. There is a difference, a big one. Moving on means carrying the past with you. Standing still means building your life around it. And somewhere over the last 11 years, I'd done exactly that. The realization settled heavily inside me, not painfully, just honestly. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows. The sound filled the room. I glanced toward the journal again. It sat exactly where I'd left it, unmoving, waiting. A strange thought crossed my mind. What if Anna had known? What if she had somehow understood the version of me that would exist after she was gone? The version that stopped making plans, stopped expecting surprises, stopped imagining a future larger than tomorrow morning. I rubbed my thumb across the edge of the cover. The leather felt smooth from age. Who had kept this all these years? Who had protected it? And why now? Why after 11 years? Why not sooner? Why not later? The questions circled endlessly. But beneath them was another question, one I wasn't quite ready to admit. What if there was something inside these pages I still needed to hear? That possibility frightened me more than the mystery, because if there was one thing grief teaches you, it's how to survive without answers. But surviving with hope, that can be terrifying. Hope asks things from you. Hope demands movement. Hope insists the story isn't finished. For 11 years, I'd convinced myself my story had become very small, predictable, manageable, save. Then a journal arrived in the mail carrying my wife's handwriting. And suddenly nothing felt safe anymore. Not in a bad way, in a living way, the kind of uncertainty I hadn't felt in years, the kind that belongs to people who still believe tomorrow might bring something unexpected. Rain continued tapping softly against the glass. The kitchen seemed quieter now, or maybe I was simply listened differently. I took a slow breath, then another. Finally, I pulled the journal closer. My hands were steadier this time. The fear hadn't disappeared, the grief hadn't disappeared. The questions certainly hadn't disappeared, but something else had appeared alongside them. Something I hadn't felt in a very long time. A reason to keep turning the page. Carefully, I opened the journal. And for the first time, I began to read. The first page wasn't what I expected. There was no explanation, no dramatic revelation, no clue about who had mailed the journal, no indication of why it had arrived after 11 years. Just a date, and beneath it, a few lines written in handwriting I knew better than my own. For a moment, I couldn't read, not because the words were difficult, because seeing them felt impossible. My eyes moved across the page slowly, carefully, as though reading too quickly might somehow break whatever fragile thing had just entered my life. Then I heard her voice. Not literally. Of course not. But anyone who has loved someone long enough understands what I mean. Certain people leave fingerprints on language. You can hear them inside their words, the rhythm, the humor, the tiny habits nobody else notices. And suddenly she was there, not in the room, but somewhere very close to it. The first entry began with a complaint about the weather. I laughed, actually laughed. A short, surprise sound that startled even me, because that was Anna. She could find a reason to argue with sunshine. She once spent an entire summer insisting the clouds were conspiring against her tomato plants. According to her, they knew exactly when to appear. I sat back in my chair, smiling despite myself. The entry continued, nothing extraordinary. Nothing life-changing, just observations, small moments. The kind of things people never think will matter someday. The kind of things that end up mattering most. She wrote about a trip to the grocery store, about a cashier who couldn't stop sneezing, about a woman who accidentally walked into the wrong car, about a dog that stole a loaf of bread from someone's shopping cart, and somehow, reading it all these years later, I could hear her laughing while she wrote, not remembering the stories. Reliving them, the house felt different, not full, not exactly, but less empty, like someone had opened a window after years of stale air. I turned the page. The next entry was longer, more personal. My pulse quickened slightly. For the first time, she mentioned me, not in some grand romantic way, not the way people write when they know their words might be read after they're gone. The opposite, the honesty of it, caught me off guard. She wrote about how stubborn I was, how I always claimed I wasn't cold, while secretly turning the thermostat higher when she wasn't looking. How I insisted I didn't need directions despite getting lost almost every time we traveled somewhere unfamiliar. How I could spend an hour helping a stranger and then forget to buy the one thing I entered a store to purchase. I found myself laughing again, then shaking my head, then staring at the page, because every word was true. The strange thing about grief is that eventually memories become polished. You remember anniversaries, vacations, important milestones. The rough edges disappear, the ordinary details fade first. But here they were, returned to me, alive again. I kept reading. Then I reached a paragraph that made me stop. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. The entry described a rainy afternoon. Nothing special, at least that's how I remembered it. We'd been stuck inside during a storm, the power had gone out. We'd spent hours sitting in the living room talking. At the time, I thought it was forgettable. One of thousands of afternoons we'd shared together. Apparently, she disagreed. According to the journal, it was one of her favorite days. She wrote about how peaceful it felt, how rare it was for life to stop demanding things from us, how she remembered the sound of rain against the windows, how she remembered us talking about absolutely nothing, and somehow loving every minute of it. I stared at the words, trying to reconcile them with my own memory, because honestly, I barely remembered that afternoon. To me it had been ordinary. To her it had been precious. The realization hit harder than I expected. We had lived the same moment, yet she had carried away something completely different. I leaned back slowly, looking around the kitchen, thinking, how many other moments had I misunderstood? How many seemingly insignificant days had mattered more than I realized? How many memories existed only because she had chosen to keep them alive? Outside, the rain continued falling, steady, gentle, the same sound she had described on those pages years earlier. For a strange moment, the distance between then and now seemed smaller, not gone, just smaller. I turned another page. Near the bottom of the entry, her handwriting changed slightly, not dramatically, just enough to suggest she had paused before continuing. The next few lines felt different, more thoughtful, more vulnerable. She wrote about time, about how quickly it moved, about how people always assume they'll have more of it, more conversations, more dinners, more ordinary afternoons. Then she wrote something that made my chest tighten, not because it was sad, because it felt important. Important in a way I couldn't yet explain. The sentence was simple, almost casual, yet it lingered on the page, as though she wanted to remember it, as though she wanted someone else to remember it too. I read it twice, then a third time, and suddenly I found myself wondering something I hadn't considered before. What else had she written? What other thoughts existed inside these pages? What other pieces of her were waiting here? The journal no longer felt like a collection of entries. It felt like a conversation interrupted by time, a conversation somehow continuing years after it should have ended. I looked at the remaining pages. There were more than I expected, far more, enough to contain months, maybe years, enough to contain things I never knew, enough to contain truths I hadn't yet discovered. For the first time since the journal arrived, my curiosity began competing with my grief, not replacing it, standing beside it, because somewhere inside these pages was a version of Anna I had never met. And suddenly I needed to know her. Then my eyes caught something near the end of the entry. A reference. Brief, almost hidden, a name, just one name. No explanation, no context, no reason it should matter. Yet something about it felt deliberate. The feeling settled quietly into the back of my mind. Like a puzzle piece I couldn't place. Not yet. I looked at the name again, then closed the journal slowly, carefully, because for the first time since this impossible package arrived, I wasn't just reading memories anymore. I was uncovering something, and I had a feeling this was only the beginning. I didn't sleep much that night, not because of the mystery, not entirely. It was the realization that kept me awake. The uncomfortable possibility that after 28 years of marriage, there were still parts of Anna I had never truly seen. The thought followed me into the darkness, into the early hours of morning, into the silence that settled over the house after midnight. I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying that rainy afternoon she'd written about, trying to remember every detail, trying to understand how two people could sit in the same room, share the same experience, and carry away completely different memories. By sunrise, I was back at the kitchen table. The journal waiting where I'd left it, popcorn, as though it already knew I would return. I poured coffee, opened the cover, and continued reading. The next entry began with a memory I recognized immediately, a family gathering. My brother's birthday, years ago, the kind of event that blurs together with dozens of others over time. Too many conversations. Too much food. Too many people talking at once. I remembered it mostly because my nephew had accidentally knocked over a pitcher of lemonade. Everyone laughed. We cleaned up the mess. Life moved on, at least that's how I remembered it. Anna remembered something else entirely. According to her journal, the most important moment that day happened in the kitchen, away from the party, away from the noise, away from me. I leaned forward, reading more carefully now. She described finding my mother standing alone by the sink, watching everyone through the window above it, smiling, and yet somehow looking lonely. Anna wrote about spending nearly an hour talking with her, listening, not fixing, not advising, just listening. I frowned. I had no memory of this conversation, none. When I reached the end of the entry, I realized why. Anna had never mentioned it, not once, not that day, not afterward, not ever. I sat quietly, the coffee cooling beside me, trying to process something surprisingly simple. My wife had lived entire experiences I never knew existed, not because she hid them, because life is bigger than the pieces we witness, even inside a marriage, especially inside a marriage. I turned the page, the next few entries deepened that feeling. Again and again, she described moments I remembered, then revealed dimensions I had completely missed, a conversation, a concern, a quiet observation, an emotion she carried privately. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive. Yet every page expanded my understanding of her. It felt strangely humbling. There is a certain arrogance hidden inside familiarity. You spend decades beside someone and begin believing you know them completely, their habits, their opinions, their routines. You learn the map so well that you forget there are still places you've never explored. The journal reminded me how wrong that assumption can be. One entry stopped me completely. Halfway down the page, Anna described a road trip we'd taken during our 40s. A trip I remembered fondly. We'd gotten lost 3 times, argued about directions twice, lawed about it later. To me, it had always been one of our happiest vacations. Apparently for Anna, it had been something else too. She wrote about sitting in the passenger seat watching me drive, watching me sing badly to songs I barely knew, watching me wave at strangers through the windshield as though I had known them my entire life. And then she wrote something unexpected, something she'd never said aloud. She wrote that she had been afraid during that trip, not of travel, not of getting lost. Afraid of time, afraid that life was moving too quickly, afraid that one day these ordinary moments would become memories. I stopped reading, my eyes lingering on the sentence, because I could hear her voice, not the words, the feeling behind them, and suddenly I remembered that trip differently. I remembered the sunsets, the roadside diners, the cheap motel with the broken air conditioner. All the things I'd forgotten, the memories came rushing back. Not because they were important, because she had made them important. Outside, sunlight filtered through the kitchen window. The rain had disappeared, the world looked brighter. Yet somehow the journal was making me look backward more clearly than ever before. I continued reading. A few pages later, I found something that unsettled me, not in a frightening way, in a deeply human way. Anna had written about fear, her fear, a fear I never knew she carried. The entry wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a confession. It was simply honest. She worried about becoming a burden someday. She worried about losing independence. She worried about leaving things unsaid. Most of all, she worried about being remembered incorrectly. I stared at that line for a long time, remembered incorrectly, not forgotten. Incorrectly, the distinction struck me. All these years, I'd been preserving memories, protecting them, holding on to them. But had I been preserving the real Anna? Or just the version grief allowed me to keep? The question lingered, heavy, uncomfortable, necessary. I looked around the room at the photographs, the familiar objects, the life we'd built together. For years I had believed memory was enough. Now I wasn't so sure. Mara captures moments, not people. People are always larger, more complicated, more beautiful, more contradictory. The journal wasn't replacing my memories. It was correcting them, expanding them, giving them depth. And with every page, I felt as though I was meeting my wife again, not the version preserved in photographs, not the version preserved by grief, the real one, a woman who worried, wandered, observed, loved, and carried entire worlds inside herself that I'd never fully explored. Then I reached the final page of the day's reading. Near the bottom was something different, not a memory, not a reflection. A reference, brief, specific, deliberate. The same name appeared again. The one I'd noticed earlier. This time it was attached to a location, a place, no explanation, no context, just a name and an address. I felt my pulse quicken. For several moments I simply stared at it, because after everything I'd read, after everything I'd discovered, one realization became impossible to ignore. Someone wanted me to find this. Someone expected me to notice. The journals weren't simply preserving memories. They were leading somewhere. And for the first time since this story began, I had something tangible, not an emotion, not a memory, a clue. I closed the journal slowly, my reflection staring back at me from the darkened kitchen window. Then I looked at the address one more time, and a thought settled quietly into my mind. Tomorrow, I was going to find out why it mattered. I spent most of the night staring at the address, not researching it, not investigating it, just staring at it, as though the longer I looked, the more likely it was to explain itself. It never did. By morning, the piece of paper sat folded beside my coffee cup. The address looked ordinary. Nothing about it suggested it held answers to 11 years of questions. Nothing about it suggested it might somehow connect me to Anna. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it mattered. The journals had changed too much already. Every page had revealed something real. Something intentional. I no longer believed in coincidences, not where this was concerned, so just after breakfast, I grabbed my keys, folded the paper into my jacket pocket, and left the house. The drive took a little over 40 minutes, long enough for doubt to join me, long enough to wonder whether I was chasing something that didn't exist, long enough to remember how strange all of this would sound if I tried explaining it to someone else. A dead wife's journal. Anonymous deliveries, clues, an address buried inside memories. It sounded ridiculous. And yet there I was, following it, because some questions eventually become impossible to ignore. The road carried me farther from the familiar parts of town, past neighborhoods I rarely visited, past old storefronts and quiet intersections. The sky was overcast again, not dark, just muted, the kind of day that feels suspended between seasons. When I finally reached the address, I almost laughed. Because it wasn't what I expected. Not a private home, not an office, not some mysterious location tied to a secret life. It was a small public library, older than most buildings around it. Red brick white trim, a narrow front entrance framed by climbing ivy. I sat in my car for a moment, confused. A library? Of all places. I looked at the address again, then at the building, then back at the address. No mistake, this was it, the exact location written in Anna's journal. A few minutes later, I stepped inside. The scent hit me immediately. Old paper, dust, wood polish, the smell of time itself. Some places don't feel like buildings, they feel like memories. This was one of them. The library was quiet. Only a few visitors moved between shelves. A woman behind the front desk glanced up and smiled politely. I smiled back, then wandered deeper inside. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking for. There was no plan, no strategy, just instinct, the strange feeling that somehow I was exactly where I needed to be. I walked slowly through the aisles, running my fingers along book spines, listening to the soft creaks of old floorboards. And then something happened, not an answer, a memory. Near the back of the building sat a reading corner, with large windows overlooking a small garden. The moment I saw it, I stopped, because suddenly I remembered Anna loved libraries, not just books. Libraries, the atmosphere, the quiet, the possibility. Whenever we traveled somewhere new, she'd find the local library before she found the best restaurant. I used to tease her about it. She'd always answer the same way. Every library tells you what a town values. At the time, I thought she was being philosophical. Now I wasn't so sure. I stood there longer than necessary, looking at the reading corner, trying to remember if she'd ever mentioned this place specifically. I couldn't, but something about it felt familiar. Then I noticed a small plaque mounted near one of the bookshelves. It listed donors who had supported renovations years earlier. My eyes scanned the names absent-mindedly, then stopped Anna's name. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. I stepped closer. Read it again. There it was clear as day. Anna Morgan, my breath caught. I had no idea she'd donated to this library. None. The discovery felt strangely similar to the journal itself. Another hidden piece of her, another part of her life I'd never fully seen. She loved this place. The voice came from behind me. I turned. An older woman stood nearby, late 60s, maybe early 70s. Gray hair, kenned eyes, the sort of face that immediately feels familiar even when it isn't. She was looking at the plaque, not at me. "Excuse me?" I said. The woman smiled, still studying the names. "Anna Morgan," she replied softly. She loved this place. A chill moved through me, not fear. Recognition, something important was happening. I was her husband. The words left my mouth before I had time to think about them. The woman's expression changed instantly, not surprise, recognition, real recognition, as though she'd been expecting those words someday. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she looked directly at me. And I saw it, the hesitation, the careful consideration, the way people look when deciding whether to tell you something important. "You look exactly the way she described," she said quietly. My pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" The woman smiled, a sad smile, a knowing smile, the kind carried by people who have been holding on to something for a very long time. "Maybe we should sit down." We moved to the reading corner by the window. Rain had started falling again, softly tapping against the glass. For several moments she remained silent, studying me, as if comparing reality against memory. Finally, she spoke. "I've been wondering when you'd come." The sentence landed like a stone. I stared at her, certain I'd heard wrong. "What?" She folded her hands carefully, then took a slow breath, and in that instant, I knew, not everything, not even close, but enough. Enough to understand that this woman knew something about the journals. Enough to understand that Anna's story had stretched far beyond the pages I had already read. Enough to realize that the mystery wasn't getting smaller, it was getting bigger. Much bigger. Outside, rain continued tracing silver lines down the window. Inside, my heart felt strangely calm, not because I had answers, because for the first time I knew I was close. Closer than I'd been since that impossible envelope arrived in my mailbox. The woman glanced toward the garden, then back at me, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried the weight of years. "Your wife asked me to do something for her." The room seemed to shrink. Every sound faded, every thought disappeared. There was only that sentence, and the realization that somewhere beyond it waited the truth. "Your wife asked me to do something for her." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The words settled between us. "Heavy quiet?" Permanent outside, rain traced slow paths down the library windows. Inside, the woman sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching me with the patience of someone who had carried a secret for a very long time. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "When?" I finally asked. The woman smiled gently. "Years ago." Years ago, the phrase echoed through me. Years ago, Anna had known something I didn't. Years ago, she had put pieces into motion that were only now reaching me. Years ago, while I was still living inside our ordinary life, she had been preparing for a future neither of us wanted to imagine. The thought hurt, not sharply, deeply. The woman reached into her bag, carefully, slowly, and removed another journal. My breath caught immediately. It looked different from the others. Older, more worn, the edges softened by time, the cover faded from years of handling. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she placed it gently on the table between us, almost reverently, as though it deserved respect, as though it carried something precious. Maybe it did. "She wanted you to have this last." The room seemed to shrink. The sound of rain faded. Even the library itself felt distant. There was only the journal, and the realization that this might be the final thing Anna would ever say to me. I looked down at it, afraid to touch it, afraid not to. "She knew?" I asked quietly. The woman lowered her eyes, then nodded. Once, slowly, the answer hurt more than I expected, not because I hadn't suspected it, because now it was real. Anna had known, at least before I did, maybe long before. And somehow she had carried that knowledge while still making breakfast, still laughing at bad movies, still arguing about thermostat settings, still living. The courage of that realization nearly broke me. not because she died, because she continued loving me while carrying a burden I never fully understood. The woman pushed the journal toward me. I placed my hand on the cover. The leather felt cool, worn smooth by time, familiar. For a brief second, I closed my eyes and then I opened it. The first page contained only a date from the final year of Anna's life. Below it was a short sentence, just one, and somehow it felt as though the entire world had narrowed into those few words. The handwriting was unmistakably hers. Steady, calm, beautifully ordinary, the way it had always been. I started reading. The entry didn't begin with sadness. That surprised me. It didn't begin with illness, or fear or regret. It began with gratitude. Anna wrote about a Tuesday morning. A completely forgettable Tuesday morning, the kind most people never remember. She described sunlight coming through the kitchen window, the smell of coffee, the sound of me humming badly while looking for my keys, and then she wrote something that made me stop breathing for a second. She wrote, "If you're reading this, then somehow these pages found their way back to you. If that happened, I hope the first thing you remember isn't the hospital. I hope it's mornings like this." My vision blurred. I lowered the journal, pressed a hand against my eyes, and waited. Not because I was crying, not yet, because I suddenly understood what she was trying to do. She wasn't trying to preserve her death. She was trying to preserve her life. The distinction changed everything. For years, most of my memories of Anna had eventually led to the same place: hospitals, treatments, goodbyes, loss. But Anna wasn't writing about any of those things. She was writing about coffee, sunlight, laughter. Ordinary days, the life we had actually lived. Slowly, I continued reading page after page, memory after memory, and with every entry, the same pattern emerged. She wasn't documenting endings, she was documenting meaning: a road trip where we got lost for hours, a rainy afternoon during a power outage, a grocery store argument about cereal, a quiet evening spent doing absolutely nothing. The moments she chose weren't dramatic. They were real, the kind of moments people rarely appreciate while they're happening, the kind of moments that become priceless later. Then everything changed. About halfway through the journal, the tone shifted, not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Anna stopped writing about the past and began writing directly to me. For several seconds, I simply stared at the page. The intimacy of it felt overwhelming. Like opening a letter never meant for anyone else. She wrote, "I know you." The three words hit harder than any emotional speech could have, because they were true. She did know me better than anyone. Maybe better than I knew myself. I kept reading. She wrote about my stubbornness, my tendency to blame myself for things outside my control, my habit of carrying guilt long after everyone else had forgiven me. And then she wrote something that made my chest tighten. She wrote, "If you're reading this years from now, there's a good chance you've convinced yourself there was something more you could have done." I stared at the sentence, frozen, because it was exactly what I had done. For 11 years, every hospital visit replayed endlessly, every decision questioned, every conversation examined, every possibility explored, as though somewhere, hidden among memory, existed a different ending. Anna seemed to understand all of it. She always had. The next paragraph shattered whatever defenses I still had left. She wrote, "There wasn't." The words blurred immediately. I looked away, toward the rain-covered window, toward the garden outside, toward anything except the page. But eventually I returned, because I needed to hear the rest. She wrote about forgiveness, not hers, mine. She wrote about how easy it is to forgive other people, and how difficult it is to forgive ourselves. Then she wrote, "If love taught us anything, I hope it taught you kindness, including kindness toward yourself." For the first time since Anna died, something shifted inside me. Not healed, not fixed, shifted. A pressure I had carried for so long that it felt permanent suddenly became visible. And once something becomes visible, it can begin to loosen. The final pages were different, gentler, almost peaceful. There was no grand farewell, no dramatic goodbye, no attempt to summarize an entire life. Instead, there was one final lesson, one final gift. Anna wrote, "Please don't spend your life protecting my memory from the future." The sentence stopped me cold. I read it again. Then again, she continued, "If you laugh, laugh completely. If you love, love completely. If life gives you another chapter, don't close the book because you missed the earlier pages." The room disappeared. The rain disappeared. Even time seemed to disappear. There was only her voice. And the impossible feeling that 11 years of grief had somehow led me here, to this moment, to these words, to this permission. Perfection I didn't realize I had been waiting for. The final entry ended with a memory, not a hospital room, not a goodbye. A simple afternoon, we were sitting on the porch watching a summer storm roll in, neither of us speaking, neither of us needing to. Anna wrote, "If I could choose one memory to live inside forever, it might be that one." Then, below it, the final sentence. the last words she ever left for me. I took a slow breath before reading them, and when I did, something inside me finally broke open. Not from sadness, from love, the sentence read, "Thank you for the life we shared. Now go live the rest of yours." I closed the journal, slowly, carefully, and for the first time in 11 years, I wasn't thinking about how Anna died. I was thinking about how she lived. And somehow, that changed everything. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The journal remained closed on the table between us. The rain continued outside, soft, steady, unhurried, as though the world understood this moment required patience. I stared at my hands, at the worn cover beneath them, at the years that suddenly felt different, not erased, not fixed. Different. The woman across from me didn't interrupt the silence. She seemed to understand that some conversations happen entirely inside a person. This was one of them. For 11 years, grief had been the lens through which I viewed everything. Every memory, every photograph, every holiday, every birthday, every quiet evening. Grief had become so familiar that I no longer questioned it. I simply carried it. Like an old coat, heavy, worn, permanent. Or at least I thought it was. Now, for the first time, I realized something uncomfortable. The weight I carried wasn't only grief. Part of it was guilt. Part of it was fear. Part of it was the belief that moving forward meant leaving Anna behind. And maybe that belief had been wrong all along. I looked toward the rain-covered window, watching droplets race each other down the glass, then disappear. The woman finally spoke, her voice gentle, careful. She worried about that. I turned toward her. What? That you'd stop living. The words landed softly, yet somehow they struck harder than anything else I'd heard that day, because they felt true. Painfully true. The woman smiled sadly. She talked about it more than once. I swallowed, unable to answer. Because somewhere deep down, I already knew. Anna knew me. She always had. She knew how fiercely I loved, and she knew how fiercely I held on. Maybe that's why she'd prepared all of this. Not because she was afraid of being forgotten. Because she was afraid I would forget myself. The thought settled quietly inside me, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a wound, it felt like understanding. Eventually, I stood, thanked the woman, tucked the journal carefully beneath my arm, and stepped outside. The rain had stopped. The clouds were beginning to break apart. Small patches of sunlight appeared overhead. I stood on the library steps for a moment, breathing, just breathing. The air smelled different after rain. Cleaner, lighter. The world felt strangely new. Not because anything had changed. The streets were the same. The buildings were the same. The trees were the same. I was the one who had changed. As I drove home, I found myself noticing things. Little things. A father teaching his daughter how to ride a bicycle. A couple laughing at a stoplight. An elderly man walking a golden retriever. Ordinary moments, the kind Anna always noticed. The kind I had spent years looking past. By the time I reached home, the sun had fully emerged. Its light spilled across the front porch. Across the windows, across the mailbox where all of this had begun. I stood there for a second, looking at it, thinking about how strange life could be. One envelope, one ordinary morning. And suddenly an entire future looked different. Inside, the house felt quieter than ever, yet somehow less lonely. I set the journal on the kitchen table, the same table where I had spent countless mornings drinking coffee alone. Then I walked toward the cabinet, opened it, and froze. A stack of unopened pancake mix sat on the top shelf, blueberry. Anna's favorite. I hadn't touched it in years, not once. Every time I saw it, I closed the cabinet again, every time, until now. I stared at the box, then slowly reached for it, a small thing. Ridiculously small, but my hand trembled anyway. Because grief rarely hides inside grand moments. It hides inside ordinary choices, the choices we stop making, the places we stop going, the things we stop doing. I set the box on the counter, looked at it, then laughed quietly. The sound surprised me. Not because it felt unfamiliar, because it felt natural. For the first time in years. An hour later, the kitchen smelled like blueberries. The windows were open. Sunlight stretched across the floorboards. And I found myself remembering Anna without immediately feeling pain. The memory arrived, stayed, like a favorite song, like distant laughter, like sunlight through old curtains. I carried my plate to the table and sat down, across from the empty chair. The same chair that had haunted me for years. Today it felt different, not occupied, not empty, simply part of the story. Part of us, part of a life that had existed and still mattered. I smiled not because I was over it, not because grief was gone, because grief and gratitude were finally learning how to sit beside each other. Later that afternoon, I did something else I hadn't done in years. I picked up the phone, called an old friend. One I'd been avoiding for no good reason other than habit. We talked for nearly an hour, about nothing important, and somehow it felt important. The sun was setting by the time the conversation ended. Warm golden light filled the living room. I stood near the window, watching shadows stretch across the yard, thinking about Anna's final words. Now go live the rest of yours. For years, I had treated those words as impossible. Now they felt different, not easy. Possible there is a difference, a huge one. Living again doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't transform your life overnight. It arrives quietly, in phone calls, in breakfasts, in open windows, in small decisions that slowly become a future. And standing there, bathed in the fading light of evening, I realized something. The journals had never been about bringing Anna back. Nothing could do that. They were about bringing me back. Back to friendships. Back to memories. Back to possibility. Back to life. I looked toward the kitchen table, the final journal resting there, peacefully. Its work complete, or so I thought, because tucked beneath it was something I hadn't noticed before. A folded piece of paper, small yellowed with age. My pulse quickened slightly. I crossed the room, picked it up, and unfolded it. There, written in Anna's unmistakable handwriting, was a single sentence, a sentence that would lead to the final answer, a sentence that would reveal why all of this had happened, and who had made sure it did. I unfolded the note carefully. The paper was thin, fragile with age, the kind of paper that had spent years waiting inside a drawer, a box, or between the pages of a book. For a moment, I simply stared at the handwriting. After everything that had happened, it still had the power to stop me, still had the power to make time feel strange. Then I read the sentence. Only one line, one direction, one final thread. It wasn't an explanation. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a name, a full name this time. And beneath it, a message. If you've made it this far, it's time to thank her. I read it twice, then a third time, and suddenly I knew exactly who Anna meant. The woman at the library, the woman who had spent years protecting these journals, the woman who had quietly waited for the day I would arrive. The realization settled over me slowly, not like a surprise, like understanding. The next morning, I drove back. The sky was clear bright, the kind of morning that feels honest. The library looked different in sunlight, less mysterious, more human. Perhaps because the mystery was finally disappearing, and the humanity was finally becoming visible. The woman was already there when I arrived, standing in the garden behind the library, watering flowers. For a few seconds, I simply watched, because there was something profoundly ordinary about the scene. And after everything, ordinary felt important. When she noticed me, she smiled. Not the smile of someone guarding a secret, the smile of someone relieved the secret no longer needed guarding. We sat together beneath a small wooden gazebo near the edge of the garden. Birds moved through nearby trees. The air smelled faintly of soil and fresh grass. Neither of us rushed the conversation. Some truths deserve patience. Eventually, I handed her the note. She glanced at it, then nodded. A soft laugh escaped her. I wondered if she'd leave that for you. I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd felt in days, maybe years. Then I asked the question that had lived inside me since the first envelope arrived. Why did she choose you? The woman looked toward the garden, thinking, remembering. When she finally answered, her voice carried years of affection. Because I was the only person who wouldn't break the promise. There was no pride in the statement, only honesty. I listened, and she began telling me a story. Years ago, long before hospitals and diagnoses, Anna had volunteered at the library not every day. Not even every week, just enough to become part of the place. Part of the people, part of the rhythm. She organized community events, helped children discover books, raised money for renovations, brought homemade cookies to staff meetings. Apparently half the town loved her. The other half simply hadn't met her yet. I laughed quietly. That sounded exactly right. The woman laughed too, then her expression softened. And the story changed. A few years before Anna died, she had approached her with an unusual request, not immediately, not dramatically, gradually. The way people discuss difficult things when they're still hoping they won't become real. At first, it was only journals, sippable journals, PGs of memories, thoughts, stories, suspicions. Nothing unusual. Then, over time, the request became something larger. Anna wanted them preserved, protected, stored somewhere safe, and, most importantly, delivered later, not immediately later. I felt my chest tighten. She planned all of this? The woman nodded slowly. Not all at once. Then she smiled. Your wife was too practical for grand plans. That made me laugh again, because it was true. Anna never believed in dramatic gestures. She believed in meaningful ones. The woman continued. As Anna's health declined, they spoke more often, not about death, about life. About memories, about me, a lot about me, apparently. That part made me nervous, the woman noticed, and laughed. Relax, she said. Most of it was good. Most of it, I shook my head. For a moment, it felt strangely normal, as though Anna still existed somewhere inside the conversation. Then the woman became quiet, and I knew we had reached the most important part. Why 11 years? I asked. The question hung between us. The oldest question, the biggest question. The one that had existed from the beginning. The woman looked down at her hands, then back at me, and finally answered. Because that's what she asked for. I stared at her, confused. She continued. Anna didn't want the journals delivered while your grief was fresh. The words landed gently, but they landed hard. She said you wouldn't hear them. I looked away, toward the garden, toward the flowers, toward anything except the truth I was beginning to recognize. Because Anna was right. 5 years after her death, I wouldn't have heard them. Maybe not even 8. Maybe not even 10. Back then, I was still trying to survive, still trying to hold the world together, still trying to carry a weight that was too heavy for one person. The woman continued softly. She told me something I'll never forget. My attention returned immediately. The woman smiled, a small smile, the kind people wear when remembering someone they deeply admired. She said, grief has seasons. I felt something shift inside me. The woman continued. She said there would come a day when missing her wouldn't be the only thing you felt. Silence followed, long, comfortable, necessary, because suddenly everything made sense. The journals, the timing, the waiting, the years, none of it had been random. None of it had been mysterious. It had been intentional, thoughtful. The greatest act of love in the entire story wasn't writing the journals. It was knowing when they should arrive. Anna hadn't sent me back into memory. She had waited until I was ready to return from it. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The garden moved gently in the breeze. Birds called from nearby branches. Life continued all around us. Sybil, unremarkable, beautiful finally. The woman reached into her bag. One last time and removed a photograph. I recognized it immediately and I stood outside the library, smiling, holding a stack of books against her chest, sunlight in her hair, life in her eyes. The woman handed it to me, carefully. This was taken the day she gave me the journals. My fingers trembled slightly as I held it, not because I was sad, because I understood. At last I understood. The journals had never been about preserving the past. They had been about protecting the future. My future. The future Anna believed I still deserved. I looked at the photograph for a long time, then smiled. And for the first time since this journey began, there were no more questions, only gratitude for Anna, for the woman beside me, for the promise she kept, for the years she waited, and for the impossible gift that arrived in my mailbox exactly when it was supposed to. Not a day sooner, not a day later, exactly when I was finally ready to receive it. A strange thing happened after the questions disappeared. For years, I had imagined answers would bring closure, that once I understood everything, some invisible door would finally shut. The grief, the uncertainty, the wondering. I thought closure would feel like an ending. Instead, it felt like a beginning. Weeks passed, then months. Life didn't transform overnight. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, no sudden reinventions, no miraculous morning where I woke up feeling entirely different. Real life doesn't work that way. Healing doesn't work that way. It arrives quietly. The way dawn arrives. It arrives gradually, almost invisibly, until one day you realize the darkness isn't as heavy as it used to be. The journals remained on a shelf in my living room, not hidden away, not displayed like sacred relics, simply present. Part of the house, part of the story, part of us. Sometimes I reread them, sometimes I didn't. The important thing was knowing they were there, not because they connected me to the past, because they reminded me to stay connected to the present. Anna had been right about something. Actually, she had been right about many things. I just spent most of our marriage pretending otherwise. But she had been especially right about this. Life doesn't stop asking to be lived, even after loss, especially after loss. One Saturday morning, I found myself standing in the backyard, coffee in hand, watching sunlight move through the trees. The garden had become overgrown over the years, not neglected, just forgotten. One of those small things that slowly disappear when nobody is paying attention. Anna used to love that garden. Every spring she would spend hours out there, planning, planting, talking to flowers as though they were employees, refusing to follow instructions. I used to tease her about it. She used to ignore me. The flowers listened about as well as I did. I smiled at the memory, then I did something unexpected. I picked up a shovel. Nothing dramatic, no emotional speech, no cinematic music, just a shovel. And a decision. For the next few hours I worked, pulling weeds, turning soil, cleaning old flower beds. The work left dirt beneath my fingernails and an ache in my back, and somehow it felt wonderful, because for years I'd been preserving things. Now I was growing something. The distinction mattered. As the weeks passed, small changes continued. I started saying yes more often, yes to lunch invitations, yes to phone calls, yes to places I hadn't visited in years, not because grief disappeared, because grief no longer made every decision. One afternoon, an old friend stopped by unexpectedly. We sat on the porch for hours talking, logging, remembering stories neither of us had thought about in decades. At one point, he mentioned Anna, without hesitation, without awkwardness, without lowering his voice. And for the first time, hearing her name didn't create silence, it created conversation. That moment stayed with me because for years, Anna's memory had felt fragile, something I needed to protect. Now it felt stronger than that. Now it felt alive, not alive in the supernatural sense, alive in the way influence remains alive, in the way kindness remains alive, in the way love continues shaping people long after the person is gone. One evening, I found myself standing in front of the bookshelf where the journals rested. Sunset filled the room. Golden light stretched across the walls, across the floor, across the worn covers of the notebooks that had changed everything. I reached out and touched the spine of the first one, then the second, then the last, and suddenly I realized something. The greatest gift Anna left behind wasn't the journals. It wasn't the memories. It wasn't even the wisdom hidden inside those pages. The greatest gift she left behind was perspective. She taught me something I had spent 11 years refusing to learn. Love is not measured by how tightly we hold on. Love is measured by what it helps us become. I stood there for a long moment, thinking about all the ordinary moments we'd shared: morning coffee, road trips, grocery store arguments, rain against windows, summer storms rolling across the horizon. Nothing extraordinary. Yet somehow everything extraordinary, because a life is not built from milestones, a life is built from Tuesdays, from ordinary afternoons, from conversations you forget until years later, from people who quietly change you while you're busy living. I walked toward the window. Outside, the garden was blooming again, small patches of color scattered across the yard, evidence of growth, evidence of time, evidence of continuation. And standing there, watching the evening settle over the world, I finally understood the answer to a question I hadn't known I was asking. What remains after someone is gone? Not their possessions, not their photographs, not even their stories. What remains is what they placed inside other people, the habits they shaped, the courage they inspired, the kindness they taught, the love they left behind. That is legacy, not something preserved, something continued. I thought about the woman at the library, the promise she kept, the years she waited, the care she invested in protecting a future she would never personally benefit from. I thought about the children Anna had helped discover books, the neighbors she had comforted, the friends she had encouraged, the strangers she had treated with kindness. Pieces of her existed everywhere, not because people remembered her, because people carried her. And suddenly the idea of loss seemed different, not smaller, just different, because maybe the people we love leave us twice, first when they go, and then, years later, when we finally realize they never really left at all. The room grew darker as the sun slipped below the horizon. The journals remained quietly on the shelf, the garden swayed in the evening breeze. And somewhere inside that ordinary moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time: peace, not perfect peace, not permanent peace, the kind real life offers, gentle, earned, human. I took one last look at the journals, then smiled, not because the story was over, because it wasn't. Life was still happening, tomorrow was still waiting, new chapters still existed. And for the first time in 11 years, I was finally ready to read them.